Hey, this is Mike with Family Handyman. Today I'm going to show you how I built this really cool rotating bar cabinet. Now at first glance it might look a little bit intimidating, but the way I built it was using 1/2-inch plywood discs, and the star of the show was the bendable plywood, which I found was really easy and fun to use. Let me show you how I built it. So I've got several different sized discs that I need to cut out, and to draw them out on the plywood, I am using this homemade compass. I've got a nail driven in here that will act as the center of the circle and the pivot as I make the circles. And then I've got some marks here, and those are the different radius of circles that I need. So I'm gonna drill a hole at each of my marks, and then I'm ready to draw the circles. I needed to make 10 total discs in the 4 different sizes. I was able to fit 8 of them on one sheet and needed a second sheet to fit the rest of them. I used 1/2-inch maple plywood, which will match the veneer that we use on the outside later on. Now that we have our circles drawn on the plywood, we need to divide them into 3 equal pie shapes. That will help us line up all the discs later on when we're ready to assemble. First thing I'm going to do is draw a line through the center from one edge to the other. I'm going to take the radius, which is the center point, to the outside and divide that by 2 and make a mark. Then I'm going to draw a perpendicular line to the initial line, and I'm going to extend that all the way through to the other side. That'll give me 3 points on the circle that I will connect to the center to give me 3 equal pie shapes. After I draw out all the circles, I roughly cut them out with a jigsaw. I'm using another compass jig, this time attached to a router, so I can trim up the rough cut circles perfectly. I removed the base of the router and used it to trace the holes on a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. I drilled the holes, then attached the base to the jig using the router's base plate screws. With the bit installed, I attached the router to the base and then measured from the bit to mark the radii of the inner diameter circles. Then I drove a nail through the mark, placed it to the center of the disc, and used the router to trim up the outside. I repeated this process with the inner diameter discs of the smaller shelf unit as well. I remeasured from the bit, moved my nail, and then trimmed up the discs. Then I glued the discs together. I started with the cabinet unit by gluing the inner disc to the top disc using the divided lines I marked earlier to make sure it was centered. Then I glued up and aligned the bottom 2 discs of the cabinet unit and moved on to the shelf unit. The top and bottom of the shelf unit are the same. They both have the smaller offset, so I glued them together and made sure they were centered. It's a good idea to weigh the discs down or nail them together with 3/4-inch nails while they are left to dry. I needed to combine the tops and bottoms of the cylinders together with these 1x6 spacers. I cut 3 lengths for the inner shelf and 3 lengths for the cabinet, and then drilled pocket holes on both ends. I fastened the spacers to the discs by lining them up with the dividing lines and flushing them out to the outside of the disc. For this cabinet, I used 8x4 sheets of 1/4-inch bendable plywood. As you can see, this plywood is very bendy and hard to deal with, so it's always a good idea to grab an extra hand to push it through the table saw. So now I'm getting ready to prepare the bendable plywood to wrap around our forms. I've already got it cut to fit in between the forms, and now I need to figure out how long it needs to be. So I'm going to measure from this point around the back to this point here, and to do that I'm going to use a string. I got to make sure that the string doesn't stretch too much so I have an accurate measurement. So now I'm going to take the string and lay it over the plywood and then transfer the mark to the plywood. That'll be where I cut the plywood to length. After cutting the bendable plywood to length, I stapled and glued stiffeners to each end of the plywood. The stiffeners are cut to fit between the tops and bottoms of the forms, and they prevent the plywood from bowing out while you bend it around. Then I added glue to the form, fit the stiffener between the top and bottom, and stapled the plywood at the beginning of the opening. Then I continued to spread glue and staple the plywood to the form, making sure it was pulled tight as I stapled. The inner shelf will only need one layer, but the cabinet needs to be a little bit sturdier, so I wrapped a second layer of plywood. I spread glue along the back and then stapled it to the form, just like I did the first layer. To cover the exposed plywood of the inner discs, I used a technique called bentwood lamination. I used strips of 1/2-inch maple cut to about 1/8 inch thin and glued, bent, and stapled these layers to the exposed edge until it was flush with the bendable plywood. Then I took the form spacers out and added a 1/4 inch thick piece of edge banding, which will hide the bendable plywood and the stiffener. You'll use the same process for the inner shelf and the cabinet units to cover all the plywood edges. When all the glue is dry, use a pattern bit to trim the top and bottom discs flush with the plywood. I needed to sand down the corners of the opening because they didn't quite flush out with the bendable plywood. After I sanded and smoothed out this unevenness, I used an all-purpose wood filler to fill any staple dimples or any gaps that remained. So while I'm waiting for the Bondo to cure, I'm going to be getting the shelf ready for veneer. Now I'm using a paper-backed veneer and I'm sticking it to the inside with contact cement. Now I don't want to use a full width sheet of veneer. It's gonna make it really hard to get it in there just right. So I'm cutting these strips of veneer into about 12-inch widths. That way I can fit them in one by one and not have to struggle to get them in. Now I'm gonna give the inside of the shelf, the plywood, 2 coats of contact cement and the paperback veneer 1 coat, and then I'm gonna fit them in. Once the veneer was installed on the inside, I wanted to add some shelves. So I traced out 2 curved shelves from an extra disc which was the same size as the inner diameter of the shelf. I added some edge banding and then nailed them on from the outside, holding them up with a few spacers while I nailed them. Then I got the cabinet unit ready for veneer. I trimmed the top flush, smoothed out any unevenness, filled staple holes and any gaps, and then added edge banding. Next, I moved to veneering the outside of the inner shelf. I started by applying 2 coats of contact cement on the plywood. Then I applied a coat onto the paperback veneer. And then I was ready to roll on the veneer. I set up a fence against my work surface to keep my veneer straight and to make sure I rolled the cabinet straight onto the veneer. To minimize any seams that will be shown, I lined up the opening of the cabinet with the edge of the veneer. Then I slowly rolled the cabinet in place until the whole outside was covered in veneer. I used a J-roller along the way to make sure all the veneer was adhered to the plywood. Then I trimmed the veneer away from the top, the bottom, and inside the opening. And then carefully trimmed the seam with a utility knife. Then I sanded everything smooth, attached the Lazy Susan hardware to the bottom, and applied finish. Then I set up my compass jig to cut a hole in the bottom of the cabinet unit so I could fit the shelf unit right through the hole. I applied some weather stripping so that the shelf unit didn't get scratches on it, and then dropped the shelf unit into the cabinet. Then I covered the hole with another plywood disc. Then the cabinet unit was ready for veneer. I followed the same steps I used for the inner shelf to get it ready for finish. Then I applied several coats of finish, fastened these great looking store-bought legs to the bottom, flipped it over, then finished the top. Now this is a great project if you're looking for a challenge and maybe to pick up a few new skills like the bent wood lamination, using the paperback veneer, or using the bendable plywood. I had a really great time building this thing, and now I've got a unique piece of furniture that I can use as a bar or a mixing cabinet, or just a cool accent table. For more woodworking projects and inspiration, head to familyhandyman.com.